Butte, Montana, March 15, 1993. The morning of March 15, 1993, began like any other routine medical appointment at St. James Hospital in Butte, Montana. 8-year-old conjoined twins Ethan and Aiden Thompson arrived with their mother, Jennifer Thompson, for their quarterly checkup with the specialized medical team that had been monitoring their condition since birth. The boys, joined at the chest and sharing portions of their cardiovascular system, had defied numerous medical predictions about their survival. Against all odds, they had reached their 8th birthday, though their future remained medically uncertain. The appointment concluded at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon. Hospital security footage would later show Jennifer walking through the main corridor with the twins, their distinctive gait drawing the usual curious glances from visitors and staff. The boys appeared in good spirits, their matching blue jackets and shared enthusiasm evident even on the grainy surveillance video. This would be the last confirmed sighting of Ethan and Aiden Thompson alive. So glad to have you here. Comment your city so I can bring cases from your region and also know where you're watching me from. At 3:47 p.m., Jennifer Thompson contacted the Butte Police Department from a payphone outside a gas station 7 miles from the hospital. Her voice carried panic as she reported her sons missing. According to her initial statement, she had stopped briefly at the hospital parking lot to retrieve something from the car. When she turned around after what she estimated was 5 minutes, the boys had vanished. No witnesses came forward despite the distinctive appearance of the missing children. The first responding officers arrived at St. James Hospital within 12 minutes. They immediately secured the parking lot and initiated a search of the surrounding area. The hospital's expansive grounds, including maintenance areas and service entrances, underwent thorough inspection. Search dogs were brought in by evening, tracking the boys' scent from the parking lot to a service road behind the hospital, where the trail inexplicably ended. Detective Robert Mitchell, a 20-year veteran of the Butte Police Department, took lead on the investigation by nightfall. His experience with missing persons cases told him the first 48 hours would be critical. The unique nature of this case, involving conjoined twins, meant the children could not easily blend into a crowd or be transported without drawing attention. Every hospital, clinic, and medical facility within a 200-mile radius received immediate notification with detailed descriptions and photographs. The media descended on Butte within 24 hours. National news networks picked up the story, broadcasting images of the smiling twins alongside urgent appeals for information. Tips flooded the police hotline, each one meticulously followed and documented. Reported sightings came from as far away as Seattle and Denver, but none proved credible upon investigation. Jennifer Thompson became the public face of anguish, appearing at press conferences with red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands. She repeated her account of the parking lot incident to multiple investigators, her story remaining consistent in its basic elements. However, certain details began to trouble Detective Mitchell. The timeline Jennifer provided contained small inconsistencies. The location where she claimed to have parked appeared different in subsequent interviews. Most concerning, surveillance footage from the hospital parking lot showed Jennifer's vehicle departing nearly 40 minutes before she reported the children missing. By March 17th, 48 hours after the disappearance, the case had expanded into a full-scale investigation involving state police and FBI resources. Volunteer search parties combed the rugged Montana terrain surrounding Butte. Abandoned buildings, mine shafts, and remote cabins underwent inspection. The community rallied with unprecedented support, but days turned into weeks without any breakthrough. On March 29th, 2 weeks after the twins vanished, a rancher discovered Jennifer Thompson's sedan abandoned on a remote access road leading to the old mining district 15 miles north of Butte. The vehicle had been carefully concealed behind an outcropping of rocks and partially covered with branches. The discovery sent investigators in a new direction. Why would Jennifer's car be found so far from where she claimed the children disappeared? The area surrounding the abandoned vehicle showed tire tracks from at least 2 different vehicles, suggesting the possibility of a planned meeting. Forensic teams processed the sedan meticulously. Inside, they found the boys' jackets, medical records from the hospital appointment, and Jennifer's purse containing her identification and wallet. Nothing appeared disturbed or indicative of a struggle. The vehicle's fuel tank was nearly empty. Most puzzling were fresh scratches on the rear bumper and traces of soil that matched samples from deep within the old Silver Creek mine complex, an extensive network of abandoned mining tunnels that had been sealed by the county decades earlier. Detective Mitchell stood at the site where the car was found, studying the harsh landscape stretching in all directions. The old mining district contained hundreds of miles of tunnels, many of them unmapped and extremely dangerous. If someone had wanted to hide something, or someone, in this unforgiving terrain, the task of finding them would be monumentally difficult. The tire tracks told a story of careful planning rather than panic. Someone had known exactly where to drive and where to leave the vehicle to maximize the time before discovery. As the sun set over the Montana mountains that evening, investigators made a decision that would define the next phase of the investigation. They would focus their efforts on exploring the abandoned mine network, beginning with Silver Creek. Specialized rescue teams with mining experience were assembled. The search would be dangerous, methodical, and time-consuming, but it represented the best lead they had encountered since the twins vanished 2 weeks earlier. What investigators did not yet know was that they were standing within a quarter-mile of where Ethan and Aiden Thompson lay, hidden deep beneath the earth in a sealed section of the mine. The answers they sought were closer than anyone imagined, but it would take 20 years and a chance discovery by amateur explorers before the truth would finally emerge from the darkness of Silver Creek Mine. The investigation was about to enter a phase that would test every resource available to law enforcement. But the real answers remained buried, waiting in the cold silence of abandoned tunnels where 2 young lives had met their tragic end. The case that had captivated the nation was only beginning to reveal its darkest secrets. Butte, Montana. Late March to April 1993. The discovery of Jennifer Thompson's abandoned vehicle transformed the investigation from a missing persons case into something far more complex and troubling. Detective Robert Mitchell assembled a task force that now included FBI agents specializing in child abduction cases, forensic accountants, and mining safety experts. Every aspect of Jennifer Thompson's life came under intense scrutiny as investigators worked to understand what had truly happened on that March afternoon. Jennifer's background painted a picture of struggle and mounting desperation. She had been widowed in November 1991 when her husband, Michael Thompson, died in a mining accident at the Berkeley Pit copper mine where he had worked for 12 years. The accident report indicated equipment failure, and the mining company had settled with Jennifer for a modest sum. However, the financial cushion provided by the settlement had been rapidly depleted by the extraordinary medical expenses associated with caring for conjoined twins. Medical records obtained through court order revealed the full scope of the challenges Jennifer faced. Ethan and Aiden required specialized care that pushed the family's resources to their limits. Insurance covered only a fraction of their needs. The boys required custom-designed clothing, adaptive equipment, and regular consultations with specialists in pediatric cardiology and surgical separation. The medical bills accumulated into hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt. Investigators discovered that Jennifer had been making inquiries about surgical separation with increasing frequency during the months before the twins disappeared. She had consulted with medical experts at facilities in Seattle, Denver, and even as far as Boston. The responses were uniformly discouraging. The boys shared critical portions of their circulatory system, and any attempt at separation carried an extremely high probability that one or both would not survive the procedure. Several surgeons had documented their concerns about Jennifer's emotional state in their consultation notes, describing her as increasingly desperate and unable to accept the medical reality of her son's condition. The financial investigation revealed troubling patterns in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. Jennifer's bank records showed unusual cash withdrawals totaling nearly $8,000 in the 2 weeks before March 15th. The money came from a series of high-interest loans she had taken against her home. When questioned about these withdrawals, Jennifer claimed she had been saving money for potential medical procedures, but could not produce any documentation or receipts showing where the cash had gone. Telephone records provided another crucial piece of the puzzle. Investigators discovered a pattern of calls between Jennifer's home phone and a number registered to Charles Brennan, a 53-year-old man with a criminal history that included fraud, theft, and involvement in illegal mining operations. Brennan had worked in the Butte mining industry for 3 decades before losing his job due to safety violations he had committed. He had continued to maintain contacts in the underground economy that still thrived in the depleted mining regions of Montana. When investigators attempted to locate Charles Brennan for questioning, they discovered he had left Butte on March 16th, just 1 day after the twins disappeared. His landlord reported that Brennan had paid 3 months' rent in cash and departed without leaving a forwarding address. His vehicle, a 1987 Ford pickup truck, matched the description of tire tracks found near Jennifer's abandoned sedan. The connection between Jennifer Thompson and Charles Brennan became a central focus of the investigation. Witnesses began to emerge with crucial information. A nurse at St. James Hospital reported seeing Jennifer in conversation with an older man matching Brennan's description in the hospital cafeteria on 2 occasions prior to March 15th. The conversations appeared intense and secretive. A gas station attendant near the mining district remembered serving a woman matching Jennifer's description on the afternoon of March 15th, accompanied by an older man. The woman had appeared distressed, and the attendant recalled seeing what might have been children in the back seat of the vehicle, though the memory was uncertain after weeks had passed. The search of the Silver Creek mine complex proved extraordinarily difficult and dangerous. The mine had been officially closed in 1985 due to economic decline and safety concerns. Decades of abandonment had made many sections unstable. Water had flooded lower levels, and toxic gases accumulated in poorly ventilated areas. Specialized teams could only search for limited periods before retreating to the surface. The mine's extensive network included over 40 miles of documented tunnels, and likely contained additional undocumented passages created by independent miners in earlier decades. After 3 weeks of intensive searching, teams had covered less than 30% of the accessible mine areas without finding any trace of the missing twins. The operation was consuming enormous resources, and pressure mounted to either expand the search or redirect efforts. Detective Mitchell fought to keep the mine search active, convinced that the soil traces on Jennifer's vehicle and the presence of Charles Brennan's tire tracks in the area meant something significant had occurred there. In mid-April, the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit completed their profile of the case. Their assessment concluded that the disappearance showed signs of planning rather than spontaneous action. The profile suggested involvement of at least 2 individuals, one with knowledge of the mine systems and another with a strong personal connection to the victims. The financial desperation documented in Jennifer's life, combined with her documented inquiries about medical options for her sons, created what the analysts termed a high-risk scenario for harm to the children. Jennifer Thompson maintained her innocence throughout increasingly aggressive questioning. She insisted she had never met Charles Brennan, despite the telephone records and witness statements. She claimed the cash withdrawals were for medical consultations she had been too embarrassed to discuss. Her explanation for the location of her abandoned vehicle was that she had been searching desperately for her sons after they disappeared from the hospital parking lot and had driven to remote areas hoping to find them. Each explanation seemed plausible in isolation, but created a pattern of improbability when examined together. By the end of April 1993, the active search for Ethan and Aiden Thompson had largely concluded without results. The case remained officially open, but resources were redirected to other investigations. The FBI maintained surveillance on Jennifer Thompson and continued efforts to locate Charles Brennan, but the trail had gone cold. The public's attention, so intense in those first weeks, began to fade as other news cycles emerged. Detective Mitchell refused to let the case rest entirely. He continued to periodically review evidence, hoping that new forensic techniques or a break in Charles Brennan's whereabouts might reopen active investigation. The mining district searches had been suspended, deemed too dangerous and resource-intensive to continue without more specific intelligence about where to search. In the Thompson home, Jennifer lived under a cloud of suspicion that never lifted. Neighbors whispered. Former friends distanced themselves. The media had moved on, but the community had not forgotten. She remained in Butte, trapped by the mortgage debt, and unable to escape the ghost of that March day when her sons had vanished. Deep in the sealed sections of Silver Creek Mine, beneath hundreds of feet of rock and earth, Ethan and Aiden Thompson lay where they had been left. The darkness that had claimed them held its secrets perfectly. It would take 20 years, advancing technology, and the curiosity of amateur explorers before those secrets would finally be exposed to the light. The truth waited patiently in the cold silence of the abandoned tunnels, and when it emerged, it would shatter any remaining doubt about what had occurred during those crucial hours in March 1993. Butte, Montana, 1993 to 2013. The case of Ethan and Aiden Thompson entered the realm of unsolved mysteries that haunt law enforcement agencies and communities alike. As 1993 turned to 1994 and then to 1995, the investigation officially transitioned from active to cold. File boxes containing thousands of pages of witness statements, forensic reports, and investigative notes were archived in the basement of the Butte Police Department headquarters. Detective Robert Mitchell retired in 1998, carrying the weight of the unsolved case with him. In his final report, he documented his enduring conviction that the answers lay somewhere in the abandoned mine system, but the dangerous conditions and vast network of tunnels had made a complete search impossible with the technology and resources available at the time. Jennifer Thompson continued to live in Butte, though the town that had once rallied around her became a place of exile. The suspicion never dissipated. Parents pulled their children away when she appeared at the grocery store. Job applications went unanswered. She survived on disability payments and occasional work cleaning houses for families who either believed in her innocence or needed help desperately enough to overlook the cloud surrounding her name. She gave no interviews, made no public statements, and retreated into a life of near-complete isolation. The search for Charles Brennan continued sporadically over the years. The FBI maintained him on their wanted list for questioning in connection with the disappearance. Occasional tips placed him in various locations across North America. A reported sighting in Vancouver in 1995 led to a brief surge of investigative activity, but the lead evaporated. A man matching his description was questioned in Winnipeg in 1999, but fingerprint analysis eliminated him as a suspect. Brennan seemed to have vanished as completely as the twins he was suspected of helping to hide. Advances in forensic science during the late 1990s and early 2000s brought renewed hope to many cold cases. DNA analysis became more sophisticated and reliable. Ground-penetrating radar technology improved dramatically. Digital databases allowed for better coordination between law enforcement agencies. In 2003, the Butte Police Department received a grant to review cold cases using updated forensic methods. The Thompson case underwent fresh analysis, but the lack of physical evidence limited what new technology could achieve. The soil samples from Jennifer's vehicle were reanalyzed, confirming they matched material from deep within the Silver Creek mine complex, but this only verified what investigators had already known. The mine itself remained sealed and largely forgotten by the community. Warning signs posted at entrances deteriorated over time. Chain-link fences sagged and developed gaps. The mining industry that had defined Butte for over a century had declined to the point where the old works were simply abandoned relics of a different era. Local authorities occasionally received reports of trespassers exploring the tunnels, typically teenagers seeking adventure or transients looking for shelter. These incidents resulted in increased security measures, but the sheer size of the mine complex made comprehensive monitoring impossible. In 2008, 15 years after the disappearance, a documentary filmmaker attempted to produce a program about the Thompson case. Jennifer refused all contact. The project ultimately aired on a cable network devoted to unsolved mysteries, presenting the known facts and speculating about various theories. The program generated a brief spike in public interest and several new tips to the FBI hotline, but none led to breakthrough developments. The documentary concluded with the case remaining as mysterious as ever, the twins' fate unknown, and the truth seemingly lost to time. By 2013, the 20th anniversary of the disappearance approached. The case had become a footnote in Butte's history, occasionally mentioned in local newspaper retrospectives about unsolved crimes. Jennifer Thompson, now in her early 50s, had become almost invisible in the community. The few who remembered the case often assumed she had moved away years earlier. Charles Brennan remained a ghost, his whereabouts unknown, his fate uncertain. The Silver Creek mine complex had deteriorated further over 2 decades. Sections of tunnel had collapsed due to groundwater infiltration and the natural settling of the earth. The deeper passages, sealed since the 1980s, were considered by structural engineers to be among the most dangerous abandoned industrial sites in Montana. The county had long since written off any possibility of reclaiming or repurposing the site. It existed as a forbidden zone on maps, a place marked with warnings but largely forgotten by newer generations who had no memory of the mining industry's heyday. In October 2013, a group of amateur spelunkers and urban explorers discovered a previously unknown access point to the Silver Creek mine system. The group, composed of 4 individuals from various parts of the Pacific Northwest, specialized in documenting abandoned industrial sites. They had obtained rough maps of the mine complex from historical archives and were attempting to photograph sections that had never been properly documented. Their interest was purely historical and archaeological, driven by fascination with industrial heritage rather than any awareness of the site's connection to the Thompson case. The explorers entered through a partially collapsed ventilation shaft on the eastern edge of the mine property, far from the main sealed entrances. The shaft descended nearly 200 feet before connecting to a horizontal tunnel that appeared on none of their maps. The passage showed signs of having been actively used more recently than the 1985 closure date, with debris and material that appeared to be from the 1990s rather than earlier decades. Approximately half a mile into this unmapped tunnel, the exploration team's lights illuminated something that made them immediately stop. In a widened section of the passage, clearly visible in the beam of their high-powered LED lights, were human remains. The distinctive positioning of the skeletal remains made it immediately apparent that these were not the bodies of adult miners who might have died in some long-forgotten accident. These were the remains of children, and the bones showed an anatomical connection that could only mean one thing. The explorers retreated from the mine immediately and contacted the Butte Police Department. Within hours, the site became an active crime scene for the first time in 20 years. The access point the explorers had discovered was secured. Specialized forensic recovery teams began the careful process of reaching the location and documenting what lay in the darkness of that isolated tunnel. News of the discovery spread through Butte within hours, reawakening a case that many had believed would never be solved. The initial reports were cautious, stating only that remains had been found in the mine and were being examined. But in a town the size of Butte, secrets rarely stayed contained. By evening, the connection to the Thompson case had become public knowledge. Jennifer Thompson heard the news from a neighbor who appeared at her door with unusual urgency. The 2 decades of waiting, the years of living under suspicion, suddenly crystallized into a moment of terrible clarity. After 20 years, her sons had been found. The truth that had been hidden in the darkness was about to emerge into the light, and with it would come answers that would either vindicate or condemn her. The silence that had protected secrets for 2 decades was about to be shattered, and nothing would ever be the same again. Butte, Montana, October to November 2013. The forensic recovery operation at Silver Creek Mine represented one of the most challenging crime scene investigations in Montana's history. The remote location, unstable tunnel conditions, and the passage of 20 years required specialists from multiple agencies. The FBI sent a team from their Evidence Response Team unit. The Montana State Crime Lab deployed senior forensic anthropologists. Mining safety engineers from the Montana Tech University provided crucial expertise in assessing tunnel stability and ensuring the recovery team's safety. The remains were located in a chamber approximately 40 feet wide and 20 feet high, a natural expansion in the tunnel system that had been reinforced with timber supports decades earlier. The skeletal remains confirmed what the initial discovery had suggested: 2 children, positioned in a way that indicated they had been conjoined at the chest. The bones lay on a deteriorated blanket, surrounded by items that painted a devastating picture of their final hours. Next to the remains sat 2 empty plastic water jugs, several open packages of crackers and granola bars, their contents long since consumed or decayed, were scattered nearby. A flashlight with dead batteries rested against the tunnel wall. Most significant was a small notebook, its pages damaged by moisture but still partially legible. The notebook contained childish handwriting, entries that documented the terror and confusion of two 8-year-old boys abandoned in absolute darkness. The forensic anthropologists worked methodically over 3 days to document and recover the remains and associated evidence. Photographs captured every detail. Measurements recorded the exact positioning of items. Soil samples from beneath and around the remains were collected for later analysis. The structural connection between the skeletons confirmed the medical records. These children had been joined at the sternum, sharing portions of their thoracic cavity. DNA analysis began immediately upon the remains reaching the state crime lab in Missoula. Despite the passage of 20 years, the cool, dry conditions in the deep mine had preserved sufficient genetic material for testing. Samples were compared against reference DNA obtained from Jennifer Thompson and from preserved medical samples collected during the boys' numerous hospital visits. The results came back within 72 hours with absolute certainty. The remains were those of Ethan and Aiden Thompson. The notebook found with the remains underwent careful preservation and analysis. Forensic document examiners worked to decipher the water-damaged pages. What they reconstructed told a story of unimaginable horror. The entries, written in Ethan's handwriting according to handwriting analysis, comparing it to school papers preserved in the case file, documented the boys' first hours in the mine. The initial entries expressed confusion about where their mother had gone and when she would return. Later entries showed growing fear and desperation as their flashlight batteries died and the supplied food and water ran out. The final legible entry, dated approximately 5 days after the disappearance, simply stated that they were very cold and afraid. Forensic pathology examination of the remains provided additional crucial information. The medical examiner's report, released 3 weeks after the discovery, concluded that the twins had survived for several days after being left in the mine. The cause of death was determined to be a combination of dehydration, hypothermia, and the stress of their medical condition without access to necessary medications. Crucially, there was no evidence of physical trauma beyond what might be expected from the boys' attempts to move through the dark tunnel. They had not been killed quickly or violently. They had been abandoned and left to die slowly in the darkness. The physical evidence found with the remains included items that could be traced to purchases. The water jugs bore labels from a regional grocery chain. Credit card records from March 1993 showed Jennifer Thompson had purchased similar items on March 14th, 1 day before the disappearance. The blanket was identified through fiber analysis as matching blankets sold at a specific retail chain. Jennifer's credit card records showed a purchase at that chain on March 12th. Each piece of evidence formed part of a pattern showing calculated preparation rather than spontaneous action. The tunnel where the remains were found had been deliberately chosen. Mining engineers determined that it was far from the main sealed entrances, but accessible to someone with knowledge of the mine's layout. The chamber where the boys were left had ventilation sufficient to sustain life temporarily, but was remote enough that any sounds would never reach the surface. Someone with specific knowledge of the mine system had selected this location carefully. In late October, a breakthrough in the search for Charles Brennan finally occurred. Following the discovery of the remains and renewed media coverage of the case, a woman in Regina, Saskatchewan, contacted the FBI. She had been in a relationship with a man named Carl Bradley for the past 8 years. After seeing news coverage of the Thompson case, she recognized the photograph of Charles Brennan as the man she knew as Carl Bradley. Canadian authorities arrested him within hours. Fingerprint analysis confirmed that Carl Bradley was indeed Charles Brennan. He had been living under the assumed identity for nearly 20 years, working construction jobs and maintaining a low profile. When confronted with the evidence from the mine and the DNA confirmation that the remains were those of Ethan and Aiden Thompson, Brennan's resistance crumbled. After consulting with his attorney, he agreed to provide a full statement in exchange for consideration in sentencing. Brennan's confession, delivered over 2 days of recorded interviews in late November 2013, revealed the complete truth of what had occurred in March 1993. He confirmed that Jennifer Thompson had contacted him in January of that year through a mutual acquaintance who knew of his familiarity with the abandoned mines. Jennifer had proposed a plan that was initially presented as finding someone who might want to adopt the boys, specifically someone in the underground market who might pay for children with a rare medical condition for research purposes. According to Brennan's statement, he had attempted to make contacts in what he claimed was a network of individuals interested in obtaining children for illegal medical experimentation. When these supposed contacts failed to materialize or proved to be fantasies based on rumors rather than reality, Jennifer had become increasingly desperate. She had already paid Brennan several $1,000s and felt she had gone too far to back out. Brennan described the events of March 15th in detail. He had met Jennifer at the hospital after the twins' appointment. They had driven in separate vehicles to the remote area near Silver Creek Mine. Jennifer had told the boys they were going on an adventure, that they would be camping. Once inside the mine, using a route Brennan knew from his years working in the area, they had reached the chamber where the remains were ultimately found. Jennifer had left supplies that she believed would last several days, though she had drastically underestimated what 2 children would need to survive. The plan, according to Brennan, had been to leave the boys temporarily while final arrangements were made for their placement. But as hours turned to days and no arrangement materialized, neither Jennifer nor Brennan returned to the mine. Brennan claimed he had argued with Jennifer about going back, but she had convinced him that the boys would already have been found by searchers, or that returning would only expose their involvement. The lie built upon itself until returning became impossible. Brennan's confession provided the final pieces of evidence needed to fully understand what had happened. The investigation that had remained unsolved for 20 years suddenly had complete clarity. 2 people, driven by desperation and enabled by moral weakness, had condemned 2 innocent children to death in the darkness of an abandoned mine. The secret that had been buried for 2 decades had finally been exposed, and justice, long delayed, was finally possible. The community of Butte, which had lived with this mystery for 20 years, now faced the terrible reality of what had occurred. The truth was worse than most had imagined. The revelation that the children had been left to die slowly, that they had survived for days in darkness, hoping for rescue that never came, struck the community with renewed grief. The investigation was complete, but the process of justice was only beginning. Butte, Montana, December 2013 to June 2014. The arrest of Jennifer Thompson occurred on December 3, 2013, 20 years and 8 months after her sons disappeared. Federal agents and local police arrived at her small rental home in the early morning hours. She offered no resistance, no protestations of innocence. 2 decades of living under suspicion had prepared her for this moment. She was charged with 2 counts of deliberate homicide, child endangerment resulting in death, and conspiracy. Charles Brennan faced identical charges in addition to flight to avoid prosecution and identity fraud. The legal proceedings that followed became one of the most closely watched criminal cases in Montana's history. The prosecution team, led by the state's attorney general, assembled a comprehensive case built on forensic evidence, witness testimony, financial records, and Brennan's detailed confession. The defense faced the monumental challenge of representing clients whose actions seemed indefensible. Yet the legal system required that they receive adequate representation and a fair trial. Brennan's legal team negotiated a plea agreement in January 2014. In exchange for his testimony against Jennifer Thompson and a detailed account of the events, prosecutors agreed to recommend concurrent rather than consecutive sentences and to eliminate the possibility of the death penalty. Brennan entered a guilty plea to 2 counts of deliberate homicide and child endangerment. His sentencing was deferred until after Jennifer Thompson's trial concluded. Jennifer Thompson's case proved more complex. Her attorneys argued that she had been suffering from severe depression and anxiety related to her son's medical condition and her financial circumstances. Psychiatric experts testified that she had been in a state of mental health crisis in early 1993. Medical records documented her declining emotional state during the months before the disappearance. Prescriptions for anxiety medications had been filled but often remained partially unused, suggesting she had not been taking them consistently. The prosecution countered with evidence of premeditation and planning. The financial transactions, the contact with Brennan, the purchases of supplies, and the careful selection of the mine location all demonstrated calculated decision-making rather than impulsive action driven by mental illness. The notebook found with the boys' remains became a centerpiece of the prosecution's case. The entries written by Ethan in those final days were read in court, the words of a frightened child abandoned by his mother, creating an emotional impact that no amount of psychiatric testimony could counter. The trial began in March 2014. Media coverage was extensive, with national networks broadcasting daily updates. The courtroom in Butte's Silverbow County Courthouse was filled beyond capacity every day. The community that had lived with this mystery for so long watched as the complete story was finally revealed in open court. Brennan's testimony consumed 3 days. He described in detail his meetings with Jennifer, the planning discussions, and the events of March 15, 1993. Under cross-examination, he admitted to his own moral failure and expressed remorse, though his credibility was severely challenged by his 20-year flight from justice. The defense worked to portray him as the primary manipulator, someone who had taken advantage of a desperate, mentally ill woman. Forensic experts presented the physical evidence. The DNA results, the analysis of the notebook, the medical examiner's findings about the cause of death, and the evidence linking the supplies found in the mine to Jennifer's purchases. Each piece formed part of an overwhelming pattern. The defense could not dispute the scientific evidence, only attempt to provide context through Jennifer's mental state at the time. Jennifer Thompson took the stand in her own defense during the trial's 4th week. Her testimony, delivered in a voice barely above a whisper, described her desperation and fear about her son's future. She spoke of the mounting medical bills, the repeated rejections from surgeons, and the growing feeling that she had no options. She admitted to making the terrible decision to involve Brennan, but claimed she had truly believed that he would find adoptive parents who could provide the medical care and resources she could not. Her testimony regarding the events of March 15th broke down repeatedly. She described telling her sons they were going on an adventure, believing that she would be able to return for them within days once arrangements were finalized. When those arrangements never materialized, she claimed she had been too frightened of prosecution to return. She expressed remorse for her actions, but struggled to explain how she could have left her sons in the mine or why she had not contacted authorities anonymously to direct them to the location. The prosecution's cross-examination was thorough and unsparing. They confronted Jennifer with the evidence of planning, the timeline of purchases, and the fact that she had maintained her deception for 20 years, even as searches continued and the community suffered. Most damaging was the notebook evidence, the final entries her son had written as he and his brother faced death in the darkness. The trial concluded after 6 weeks of testimony and evidence presentation. Closing arguments synthesized the complex case into competing narratives. The prosecution portrayed Jennifer Thompson as a woman who had made a calculated decision to end her sons' lives when they became too burdensome, disguising it as a disappearance to avoid immediate suspicion. The defense argued that she was a mentally ill woman who had made terrible decisions while in crisis but had never intended for her sons to die. The jury deliberated for 4 days. The wait was excruciating for everyone involved. The community of Butte, which had carried this case for 20 years, held its collective breath. On April 18, 2014, the jury returned with their verdict. Jennifer Thompson was found guilty on all counts: 2 counts of deliberate homicide, 2 counts of child endangerment resulting in death, and conspiracy. The guilty verdict brought no celebration, only a somber recognition that justice had finally been served. The families of Ethan and Aiden Thompson, extended relatives who had lost the boys 2 decades earlier, wept quietly in the courtroom. Jennifer Thompson showed no visible reaction as the verdicts were read, her face a mask that had long since learned to hide emotion. Sentencing was scheduled for 2 months later, giving both sides time to prepare statements and recommendations. The prosecution would seek the maximum penalty allowed under Montana law. The defense would argue for consideration of Jennifer's mental health issues and the fact that she had lived under the weight of her actions for 20 years. Charles Brennan's sentencing would follow Jennifer's, his fate tied to the outcome of her case. As the trial concluded and the community began processing the verdict, attention turned to the final chapter of this long tragedy. 2 children had died in an abandoned mine, victims of desperation and moral failure. 2 adults would face the consequences of their actions. The legal system had worked slowly but thoroughly, and justice, though long delayed, had been achieved. All that remained was the final sentencing, which would determine how the remainder of Jennifer Thompson's and Charles Brennan's lives would be spent, and whether any semblance of closure could be found for a community that had suffered alongside the victims for 20 years. Butte, Montana, June 2014 to present. The sentencing hearing for Jennifer Thompson took place on June 12, 2014, in the same courtroom where her trial had concluded 2 months earlier. The proceeding attracted the same intense media attention, though the atmosphere carried a different weight. The verdict had been rendered. Now the community and the legal system faced the task of determining what punishment fit crimes of such magnitude and tragedy. The prosecution presented their sentencing recommendation first. They argued for life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, emphasizing the deliberate nature of the crime, the vulnerability of the victims, and the 20 years Jennifer had remained silent while the community suffered. They noted that she had never voluntarily come forward, only facing justice when forensic evidence made denial impossible. The prosecutor read excerpts from the notebook found with Ethan and Aiden, reminding the court of the suffering the boys had endured in their final days. The defense presented a different narrative during their sentencing argument. Mental health experts testified about Jennifer's psychological state in 1993, documenting severe depression and anxiety that had gone largely untreated. They presented evidence of her deteriorating mental health in the months before the crime and argued that while her actions were criminal, they emerged from a mind in crisis rather than one acting with cold calculation. They noted that she had lived with the guilt and consequences of her actions for 2 decades, essentially serving a sentence of psychological torture even before her arrest. Family members of the victims were given the opportunity to address the court through victim impact statements. Ethan and Aiden's maternal grandmother, now in her late 70s, spoke about the loss of her grandsons and the pain of 20 years without answers. Other relatives described how the case had affected their lives, the endless wondering, and the inability to find closure while the boys' fate remained unknown. Their statements were emotional but measured, focusing on the loss of the children rather than calling for vengeance. Judge Catherine Morrison, who had presided over the trial with careful attention to legal procedure, delivered the sentence after hearing all arguments and statements. She addressed Jennifer directly, acknowledging the mental health issues while emphasizing that the planning and premeditation evident in the case demonstrated a level of decision-making capacity that could not be excused by psychiatric conditions alone. For the 2 counts of deliberate homicide, Judge Morrison imposed 2 consecutive life sentences. For the child endangerment charges, she added an additional 40 years to run consecutively. Jennifer Thompson, at age 52, would spend the remainder of her life in the Montana Women's Prison without any possibility of parole. Charles Brennan's sentencing followed 1 week later. Despite his cooperation and guilty plea, Judge Morrison determined that his actions warranted severe punishment. His knowledge of the mine system and his willingness to participate in abandoning 2 children in such conditions, combined with his 20-year flight from justice, demonstrated a level of moral failure that could not be mitigated by his eventual cooperation. Brennan received life imprisonment without parole, with his sentence to be served at the Montana State Prison. His cooperation had saved the state the expense and uncertainty of a second trial, but it had not earned him any reduction in his ultimate sentence. The conclusion of the legal proceedings brought a measure of closure to Butte and to the family members who had lived with this tragedy for more than 2 decades. In August 2014, Ethan and Aiden Thompson were finally laid to rest in a funeral service attended by hundreds of community members. The boys were buried together in Mountain View Cemetery, their graves marked by a shared headstone that celebrated their brief lives rather than focusing on the manner of their deaths. The case prompted significant changes in how Montana law enforcement handled missing children cases involving vulnerable populations. New protocols were established for investigating disappearances of children with special medical needs. Training programs were developed to help investigators recognize signs of family stress that might indicate risk to children. The Thompson case became a teaching example in criminal justice programs, studied for its investigative challenges and the importance of persistence even when cases grow cold. The Silver Creek mine complex was permanently sealed following the recovery of the remains. The county commissioned engineering work to collapse and fill the accessible tunnels, ensuring that the site could never again be used to hide evidence of crimes. A small memorial was erected at the mine's former entrance, acknowledging the tragedy that had occurred there and honoring the memory of Ethan and Aiden Thompson. Jennifer Thompson and Charles Brennan both declined media interviews following their sentencing. Jennifer was reported by prison officials to be a quiet, withdrawn inmate who participated in available mental health treatment programs, but rarely spoke about her case. Brennan similarly maintained a low profile within the prison system, his life effectively over at age 74 when he was sentenced. Detective Robert Mitchell, who had retired years before the case was solved, lived to see the resolution of the investigation that had haunted him. He passed away in 2016 at age 79, having witnessed the justice he had long believed was possible if the truth could ever be uncovered from the mine. His widow reported that the solving of the Thompson case had brought him peace in his final years, validating his conviction that the answers had always been there, waiting in the darkness. The 4 amateur explorers who discovered the remains in October 2013 received commendations from the Montana governor for their role in solving the case. They had entered the mine seeking historical documentation and instead had provided the breakthrough that brought 2 decades of suffering to an end. Their careful preservation of the scene and immediate notification of authorities had been crucial to the forensic investigation that followed. The Thompson case remains one of Montana's most extensively documented criminal investigations. The case files, comprising thousands of pages of reports, forensic analyses, and trial transcripts, serve as a resource for law enforcement training. The investigation demonstrated both the limitations of 1990s forensic technology and the power of modern techniques to solve even decades-old cases when physical evidence can be recovered and preserved. For the community of Butte, the case represented a long chapter in the town's history that had finally closed. The mystery that had haunted the community for 20 years was solved, the perpetrators punished, and the victims honored. The resolution brought no joy, only the somber satisfaction that truth had prevailed and justice had been served. Ethan and Aiden Thompson, who had defied medical predictions by surviving 8 years against difficult odds, are remembered not for how they died, but for the courage they showed in their brief lives. Their story serves as a reminder of the vulnerability of children who depend entirely on adults for their safety and well-being. The failure of 2 adults to protect them resulted in tragedy, but the persistence of investigators and the advancement of forensic science eventually brought their story to light. The case stands as testimony to the principle that some crimes, no matter how carefully concealed or how much time passes, can never truly remain hidden. The truth may be delayed, but it cannot be permanently buried. Ethan and Aiden Thompson waited 20 years in the darkness of Silver Creek Mine for their story to be told. When it finally emerged, it brought justice, closure, and the assurance that even the most vulnerable victims will not be forgotten.